Now, a brutal daylight murder in Texas has shocked the United States. A 32-year-old mother of five has been stabbed to death in broad daylight.
When investigators begin examining a violent crime, they rarely look at one moment in isolation. They build a timeline, starting well before the incident and continuing long after it has ended. Every phone call, every movement, every conversation, and every piece of physical evidence becomes another part of a much larger picture. That is exactly what detectives began doing in the hours after Caro Pine was attacked. At first, investigators faced the same challenge that exists in nearly every homicide case. Witnesses often remember events differently. Stress affects perception. People focus on different details, and memories begin to change almost immediately after a traumatic event. Because of that, detectives look for evidence that exists independently of human memory. In this investigation, one of the most valuable resources reportedly came from surveillance cameras located near the scene. Modern residential neighborhoods are increasingly covered by doorbell cameras and security systems that quietly record activity throughout the day. Those recordings have become an essential tool for investigators because they provide a timeline that can be reviewed repeatedly rather than relying only on recollections. According to court documents, detectives obtained video that allegedly captured portions of the confrontation. Investigators believe the recordings helped establish when people arrived, how the encounter unfolded, and who was present during the incident. They also compared those recordings with witness statements to determine whether different accounts matched the physical evidence. Surveillance footage, however, is only one part of an investigation. Detectives also look for forensic evidence. Clothing, footwear, vehicles, fingerprints, biological material, and electronic devices all have potential to reveal information that isn't immediately obvious. Even seemingly ordinary objects often become important when examined alongside everything else collected during an investigation. Police documents indicate that officers later searched another residence connected to the investigation. During that search, investigators documented observations they believe were relevant to reconstructing the timeline after the confrontation. According to the affidavit, officers believe some clothing recovered at the residence matched garments visible in the surveillance footage. Investigators also noted that some of those items had allegedly been placed inside a washing machine. That detail has received significant attention because prosecutors may argue it reflects an effort to alter or destroy evidence. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, will have the opportunity to challenge both the interpretation of those observations and the conclusions investigators reached. This distinction is important. Finding an item does not automatically establish why it was there. In every criminal case, investigators present one interpretation of the evidence, while the defense is entitled to present another. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of a judge or a jury to decide which explanation is supported by the evidence presented in court. Another issue that has generated widespread discussion involves the criminal charges themselves. Many people have asked why multiple defendants face murder charges if investigators allege that only one individual carried the knife. The answer lies in the legal theory prosecutors intend to pursue. Under Texas law, people who knowingly participate in the commission of certain crimes may be held criminally responsible for the actions of others involved in the same offense. This principle does not eliminate the need for prosecutors to prove their case. Instead, it establishes a legal framework allowing them to argue that responsibility extends beyond the individual who allegedly inflicted the fatal injuries. Whether prosecutors successfully establish that theory remains to be seen. At this stage, the charges represent allegations. The defendants have a right to challenge witness testimony, forensic findings, surveillance evidence, and every other aspect of the investigation. The legal process exists to examine those competing arguments before reaching a verdict. As the case continues moving to the courts, investigators are expected to release additional information through hearings, filings, and evidence presented during future proceedings. Those developments may answer questions that remain unresolved today. For example, authorities have not publicly explained the complete relationship between the people involved. While investigators have indicated the encounter was not random, they have released very little information regarding the events leading up to the confrontation or the circumstances that brought everyone to the same location that afternoon. Understanding that background will likely become an important part of the prosecution's presentation if the case proceeds to trial. Jurors often seek not only to understand what happened, but also why it happened. Establishing motive is not always legally required, but it frequently helps explain the sequence of events and the decisions made by those involved. Until then, much of the public discussion continues to focus on unanswered questions. As with many high-profile criminal investigations, speculation has spread rapidly across social media. Some theories have little supporting evidence, while others are based on partial information released through official documents. For investigators, however, speculation has little value. Detectives rely on interviews, physical evidence, forensic testing, digital records, and documented observations rather than online commentary. Their objective is to assemble a factual timeline that can withstand scrutiny in court. As more records become available, the public will likely gain a clearer understanding of what occurred before, during, and after the confrontation. Until that process unfolds, many important details remain the subject of an active criminal investigation rather than established fact. As the investigation gathered momentum, another story began emerging alongside the police reports. It wasn't about evidence or criminal charges. It was about the woman whose life had been cut short. For many people outside Del Rio, Caroline Caro became known only through news headlines and social media posts. Her name appeared beside words like stabbing, suspects, and murder investigation. But for the people who knew her personally, those headlines captured only the final chapter of a much larger story. Friends described Caro as someone who brought energy wherever she went. They remembered her sense of humor or loyalty and her ability to reconnect with people even after months or years apart. According to those closest to her, she had the kind of personality that made others feel comfortable almost immediately. More than anything else, though, they remembered her as a mother. By every public account, raising her children was at the center of her life. Friends have spoken about how proud she was of them and how much of her time revolved around their daily lives. Family photographs and videos shared online show ordinary moments that many parents would recognize immediately. Birthday celebrations, family outings, smiles captured without anyone realizing those memories would later take on a completely different meaning. Those images now serve as reminders that before becoming the subject of a homicide investigation, Caro was living the same kind of life millions of parents live every day. One detail shared publicly by a close friend has resonated with many people following the case. On the morning of the incident, Caro reportedly placed a phone call to one of her closest friends. The call wasn't answered. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Missed calls happen every day. People become busy with work, errands, or family responsibilities. Most unanswered calls are returned later without a second thought. This one never would be. After learning what had happened, Caro's friend spoke openly about the guilt she has carried since that day. She has wondered whether answering the phone might have changed something. Perhaps the conversation would have delayed Caro's plans. Perhaps she would have chosen a different route, or arrived somewhere at a different time. Or perhaps nothing would change at all. There is no way to know. Investigators have never suggested the missed phone call had any connection to the attack itself. Instead, it has become one of those painful details that often surround unexpected tragedies. People naturally replay events in their minds, searching for moments that might have altered the outcome. It is a deeply human response, even when there is no evidence that anything would have been different. As investigators focus on evidence, family and friends were left trying to make sense of a loss that could not be undone. Meanwhile, detectives continued reconstructing the events leading up to the confrontation. Public statements from investigators have indicated that this was not believed to be a random encounter between strangers. According to the Del Rio police chief, the individuals involved were known to one another. That single statement immediately shifted the direction of public discussion. If the people involved already knew each other, then investigators had to answer an entirely different set of questions. How long had they known one another? What brought everyone together that afternoon? Had there been previous disagreements? Was a confrontation planned? Or did it escalate unexpectedly after everyone arrived? At this stage of the investigation, authorities have released very few answers. Law enforcement officials frequently withhold details like these during active homicide investigations. Revealing too much information too early can complicate witness interviews or affect future court proceedings. Instead, investigators often release only the information necessary to keep the public informed while preserving the integrity of the case. One statement contained in police documents has also attracted attention. According to investigators, one of the defendants claimed that Caro arrived looking for a fight. Police documented the statement as part of their investigation. But documenting a statement is not the same as confirming its accuracy. Detectives routinely record different accounts from everyone involved before comparing those statements with physical evidence, surveillance footage, and witness testimony. Whether that claim is ultimately supported or contradicted by other evidence remains a question for the legal process. Another detail has generated curiosity among those closely following the case. Police documents identify the location where the confrontation allegedly occurred. However, publicly available information also suggests one of the defendants resided next door rather than at the address where the incident took place. That seemingly minor detail raises additional questions. Who lived at the property where the confrontation occurred? Why did everyone gather there instead of somewhere else? Was the location chosen intentionally, or did events simply unfold there by chance? For now, investigators have not publicly answered those questions. As detectives continued examining the evidence, they turned to what will become one of the most important parts of the investigation. Unlike witness recollections, this evidence could be reviewed repeatedly, frame by frame, allowing investigators to compare every movement against the statements they had already collected. That evidence came from surveillance cameras positioned near the scene, and according to police, the recordings will provide a much clearer picture of how the confrontation unfolded. In almost every major criminal investigation, there comes a point when the focus shifts away from what people say and toward what investigators believe they can prove. Witnesses provide important information, but memories are imperfect. Two people can witness the same event and remember it differently. Stress, fear, and confusion often affect what someone believes they saw. That is why detectives constantly compare witness accounts against physical evidence. According to publicly released police documents, investigators in this case believe one of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from surveillance footage recorded near the scene. Police allege the recording begins before the violence starts. According to the affidavit, Caro arrives first in a black pickup truck. A short time later, another vehicle, identified by investigators as a black Chrysler, enters the area. At first glance, it appears to be an ordinary arrival. Nothing about the vehicles themselves suggests what is about to happen. But detectives believe those few moments become the beginning of the timeline that prosecutors will eventually present in court. According to police, two of the women exit the Chrysler and approach Caro. Investigators allege that Amaya Cookie Diaz can be seen holding what appears to be a knife in her right hand before the confrontation becomes physical. Police further allege that the confrontation escalates rapidly. According to the affidavit, Cookie allegedly strikes Caro during the encounter before the other two defendants also become involved in the altercation. Those allegations have not yet been tested in court, and each defendant remains presumed innocent unless proven guilty. Still, investigators believe the video provides a valuable chronological record that helps explain the sequence of events. Unlike eyewitness testimony, surveillance footage allows detectives to examine individual moments repeatedly. Investigators often slow recordings down frame by frame, measuring movements that happen in only a few seconds. They compare clothing, positions, body movements, and timing with witness interviews to determine whether different accounts align with what the camera recorded. The affidavit also reportedly describes what each person was wearing during the incident. According to investigators, Cookie was wearing a red tank top and blue jeans. Kitty was reportedly wearing a pink tank top and blue jeans. At first, these descriptions may seem insignificant. After all, clothing is rarely the first thing people think about during a violent crime. For investigators, however, clothing often becomes an important piece of forensic evidence. It can contain biological material. It can establish identity. It can confirm movements captured by surveillance footage. And it can help detectives determine whether someone changed clothing after an incident occurred. According to police, the injuries sustained by Caro were consistent with violent and close-range assault. Investigators state that she suffered 3 stab wounds, 2 to her back and 1 to her abdomen. Those findings became another point of comparison for detectives as they reviewed the surveillance footage and medical evidence together. The investigation did not end once the confrontation was over. Police alleged the three women left the area shortly afterward. From that point forward, detectives began working to determine where they went and what they did before officers located them. Every movement during those next 2 hours became part of the investigation. Modern investigations often rely heavily on timelines. Investigators attempt to account for every significant action. When did someone leave? Who traveled together? Did anyone stop along the way? Were phones used? Did anyone contact relatives or friends? Did anyone attempt to dispose of evidence? Those questions become especially important when multiple people are involved because investigators must determine whether actions were coordinated or entirely separate. According to police records, officers eventually traced the investigation to another residence elsewhere in Del Rio. Outside that location sat the same black Chrysler investigators believed had been used earlier that afternoon. Finding the vehicle where investigators expected it to be reportedly strengthened the timeline they had already begun constructing. Officers approached the residence and took the suspects into custody without incident. One detail from the police documents has drawn significant public attention since then. According to investigators, Kitty's young son was inside the residence when officers arrived. Police have not publicly suggested that the child witnessed the earlier confrontation, nor have they released additional information regarding his involvement. Even so, the detail serves as another reminder that violent crimes often affect far more people than those directly involved. Families, children, friends, and entire communities frequently experience consequences that continue long after an arrest has been made. For investigators, however, the search of that residence was only beginning. According to the affidavit, officers soon began documenting observations that they believed could become important pieces of evidence. Some of those observations would eventually lead to an additional criminal allegation against one of the defendants, and they would become one of the most closely examined aspects of the entire investigation. In the next stage of the case, detectives would shift their attention from what happened during the confrontation to what police believe happened afterward, a distinction prosecutors may argue reveals as much about the investigation as the attack itself. For investigators, a violent crime doesn't end when the violence stops. In many cases, what happens afterward becomes just as important as the crime itself. Detectives often pay close attention to the decisions people make during the minutes and hours that follow. Those decisions are rarely viewed in isolation. Instead, investigators compare them against surveillance footage, forensic evidence, witness interviews, phone records, and every other piece of information collected throughout the investigation. That appears to be exactly what happened in this case. According to publicly released police documents, officers arrived at a second residence only a short time after the confrontation. By then, detectives had already begun building a timeline, using witness interviews and surveillance footage. Now they wanted to determine whether the physical evidence they found matched the sequence of events they believed had taken place. One of the first things investigators reportedly noticed involved the clothing worn by the two sisters. Earlier in the investigation, detectives had reviewed surveillance footage showing what they believed the women were wearing during the confrontation. When officers encountered them again at the second residence, police alleged those outfits had changed. Changing clothes is not by itself evidence of a crime. People change clothing every day for countless ordinary reasons. That is why investigators never rely on a single observation. Instead, they ask whether several independent pieces of evidence point toward the same conclusion. According to the affidavit, officers also observed that both women appear to have showered shortly before police arrived. Investigators documented that their hair was still wet during the arrests. Again, those observations alone do not establish criminal responsibility, but detectives viewed them alongside everything else they had already collected. Police then searched the residence. According to investigators, they located clothing believed to match garments visible in the surveillance footage reviewed earlier in the day. Those clothes were reportedly found inside a washing machine. That discovery would later become one of the most discussed details in the entire investigation. From a forensic standpoint, clothing often contains valuable evidence. Depending on the circumstances, investigators may recover blood, DNA, fibers, fingerprints, or other microscopic material that helps reconstruct what happened during a violent encounter. Even after clothing has been washed, Forensic laboratories are sometimes able to detect evidence invisible to the naked eye. Because of that, investigators generally treat clothing as an important source of physical evidence. Police allege that the condition and location of the clothing inside the residence supported an additional criminal allegation against Kitty Diaz. Unlike the murder allegation, which applies to all three defendants, this additional charge involves alleged evidence tampering. The purpose of that charge is not to establish who committed the assault. Instead, it concerns what investigators believe occurred afterward. Prosecutors may argue that certain actions were intended to affect evidence connected to the investigation. Defense attorneys, however, will have the opportunity to challenge every aspect of those allegations. They may question the interpretation of the evidence, the timeline presented by investigators, or whether innocent explanations exist for the observations described in the affidavit. Those competing arguments will eventually be considered through the court process rather than through public opinion. One aspect of the timeline has generated particularly strong public reaction. According to investigators, the arrest occurred only a few hours after the confrontation. At that point, Caro had not yet died. She remained under medical care, while doctors continued trying to save her life. Hours later, she would be pronounced dead. The timing matters because many people first encountered this case through the now widely circulated arrest footage. When viewers later learned that Caro was still alive while the arrests were taking place, public discussion intensified. It is important to separate emotional reaction from legal analysis. A person's appearance or demeanor during an arrest does not determine whether they are guilty of a crime. Criminal responsibility is decided through evidence presented in court, not through public impressions formed from a short video clip. Even so, videos often become part of a much larger public conversation surrounding high-profile cases. As investigators continued reviewing evidence, another question quickly emerged. If police allege only one person carried a knife, why do all three defendants face murder charges? The answer lies not in the physical evidence alone, but in the legal framework prosecutors believe applies to the case. Under Texas law, prosecutors are permitted in certain circumstances to pursue criminal responsibility against multiple participants when they believe individuals knowingly acted together during the commission of an offense. This legal principle is commonly referred to as the law of parties. It does not eliminate the prosecutor's burden of proof. Instead, it establishes a legal theory that allows responsibility to extend beyond the individual alleged to have inflicted the fatal injuries. Whether that legal theory ultimately succeeds depends on the evidence presented in court and the decisions reached by a judge or jury. For now, the investigation continues moving through the early stages of the criminal justice system. The defendants have been charged, but the case still must proceed through additional legal steps before it reaches trial. As more evidence becomes public, investigators, attorneys, and eventually jurors will examine each piece separately before deciding how it fits into the larger picture. Although investigators believe they have assembled a strong timeline, several important questions remain unanswered, and those unanswered questions may become some of the most significant issues in the case as it moves forward. As this case continues through the criminal justice system, many of the answers people want simply do not exist in the public record yet. That's often one of the hardest realities for families, investigators, and the public to accept. An arrest marks the beginning of a legal process, not the end of an investigation. Over the coming months, prosecutors will continue reviewing evidence gathered by investigators. Defense attorneys will examine the same evidence from a different perspective, looking for inconsistencies, unanswered questions, or alternative explanations. Both sides will have opportunities to file motions, challenge evidence, question witnesses, and argue their positions before the court. At this stage, the defendants have been charged, but criminal charges are allegations rather than findings of guilt. Under the American justice system, every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That legal standard exists to protect the integrity of the judicial process, ensuring that verdicts are based on evidence presented in court rather than speculation or public opinion. As more information becomes available, one of the most important issues prosecutors will likely address is motive. Although investigators have publicly stated that the people involved were not strangers, they have not fully explained what led to the confrontation. Understanding the relationship between the individuals involved may help explain why they came together that afternoon, but it will not necessarily answer every question surrounding the incident. Motive often helps juries understand why a crime may have occurred, but it is not always required to obtain a conviction. Prosecutors must prove the elements of the offense charged, regardless of whether they can establish every emotional or personal factor that contributed to the confrontation. Another issue likely to receive close attention is the digital evidence collected during the investigation. Modern homicide investigations rarely rely on physical evidence alone. Detectives frequently analyze surveillance recordings, mobile phone data, text messages, social media activity, photographs, and location information to establish timelines. Each source provides another opportunity to verify or challenge statements made during interviews. If additional digital evidence is introduced during future hearings, it may clarify some of the questions that remain unanswered today. Forensic testing will also continue to play an important role. Items collected during searches are often sent to crime laboratories for detailed examination. Scientists may test clothing, biological material, fingerprints, DNA, or other trace evidence to determine whether those findings support or contradict investigators' theories. Those analyses take time. Laboratories process thousands of cases each year, and results often become available weeks or even months after an arrest has been made. Because of that, investigators sometimes continue receiving new information long after the initial charges have been filed. The court process itself is also likely to unfold gradually. Before any trial begins, both prosecutors and defense attorneys typically exchange evidence through a process known as discovery. Witness lists are prepared, expert opinions are reviewed, motions are argued before the judge, and legal questions are resolved before jurors are ever selected. Only after those steps are completed would a jury hear testimony and evaluate the evidence presented by both sides. Until then, many of the most important questions remain unanswered. Authorities have not publicly explained the complete history between everyone involved. The full sequence of conversations leading up to the confrontation has not been released. Investigators have not publicly discussed every piece of forensic evidence collected during the case. Future court filings may answer some of those questions, while others may not become clear until testimony is presented during trial. Cases like this also serve as a reminder of how dramatically social media has changed the way criminal investigations are viewed by the public. Within hours of the arrest, short video clips spread across multiple platforms, reaching millions of people long, before official court documents became widely available. Those videos sparked passionate reactions, but they represented only a small part of a much larger investigation. Courtrooms operate differently than social media. Judges and juries do not decide cases based on viral clips, trending discussions, or online commentary. They evaluate sworn testimony, physical evidence, expert analysis, and the legal standards established by the court. That distinction is essential because high-profile cases often generate strong emotions long before every fact becomes known. While the legal process moves forward, another reality remains unchanged. A family continues grieving the loss of someone they loved. Friends continue remembering the person they knew rather than the headline seen by millions of strangers. 5 children continue growing up without their mother. For them, this case is not measured by court dates or legal filings. It is measured by birthdays, holidays, graduations, and ordinary moments that will forever feel different because one person is no longer there. Regardless of how the legal proceedings ultimately conclude, nothing can undo that loss. As future hearings take place, additional evidence will almost certainly become public. Court filings, witness testimony, and forensic findings will help build a clearer understanding of exactly what happened and why investigators reached the conclusions reflected in their reports. Until then, the facts remain those contained in publicly available police documents and official statements. The defendants have been charged but have not been convicted. They remain presumed innocent unless and until a court determines otherwise. The investigation continues. The legal process moves forward, and a community waits for answers that only time, evidence, and the courts will ultimately provide.